Good afternoon. I would like first of all to thank the University of Oulu in Finland for according us these facilities to record our short series on the question of regional and transnational history. And my talk this afternoon is on the question of the English Pale in Tudor Ireland. The status of the English Pale in Ireland as a frontier region of the Tudor state is at present scarcely recognised. Indeed, perhaps the most notable aspect of its development and demise is the wide gap between the reality of the Pale during its short existence and popular perceptions of how it emerged and what it meant. In reality, the English Pale was first so named in 1495, probably by members of the military retinue of Sir Edward Poynings, the famous English governor, who was transferred from the English military outpost at Calais in late 1494. The Pale disappeared as a military frontier with the completion of the Tudor conquest of Ireland in 1603. Yet an indication of its former significance is preserved in the phrases "within the Pale" and "beyond the Pale," which denote the bounds of civilization or of civilized behavior. And interestingly, these terms reflect the rhetoric of difference which English officials had earlier developed in order to emphasize the cultural divide they sought to draw between English civility and Irish savagery. By the late 16th century too, English Elizabethan chroniclers such as Richard Stanihurst and the author of the Book of Howth believed, quite wrongly, that the Pale had originated with the Norman conquest in the 12th century. And sections of what was thought to be the Pale Ditch, the system of earthen dykes and ditches erected around the Pale marches, survived in popular memory into modern times, to be recorded in the Ordnance Survey. The English Pale comprised the so-called four obedient shires of Dublin, Louth, Meath and Kildare, which formed the arable coastal plain of Eastern Ireland. It was bounded to the north and south by pastoral upland districts which had largely remained in Gaelic occupation, so creating a frontier between English and Gaelic Ireland, which was a comparatively narrow strip of land, characterised by a close coincidence of geographical, cultural, political, military and administrative boundaries. So, within a few short miles, the nucleated settlements of the English shires gave place to the dispersed settlement patterns of Gaelic lordships, agriculture to pastoralism, English settlers to Gaelic clansmen, English cloaks to Gaelic mantles, and common law to Brehon law. To the west, however, where there were no natural geographical divisions and the champaign ground of the coastal plain simply faded imperceptibly into the bogs of the Midlands, the frontiers took the form of an extended march many miles wide. In the typically English mixed farming districts of the Pale Heartland, the nucleated villages were sited sufficiently close together to afford each other mutual protection against casual Gaelic raids. The region's defences were also strengthened by the building of castles and walled towns. Yet the economic depression and demographic decline of the later Middle Ages hit the English districts much harder than Gaelic Ireland, undermining settlements on marginal land and prompting a shift from agriculture to pastoralism. In the face of mounting Gaelic raids, the defence of these pastoral regions, with their typically more dispersed settlement patterns and few market towns, proved much more difficult to organise. And even where they held on, some English landowning families, such as the Harolds in the Dublin Marches or the Dillons in Westmeath, developed as quasi-independent lineages which closely resembled the neighbouring Gaelic clans. But from the early 15th century, the gentry families of the four obedient shires, encouraged by the Dublin government, began to build in large numbers tower houses to defend their estates. These tower houses were freestanding stone keeps, usually 3 or 4 stories high, with battlements, and were a distinctive architectural feature of Ireland and the Anglo-Scottish border region in the 15th and 16th centuries. The principal entry points into the English Pale were likewise guarded in this manner with tower houses and fortified bridges. Concurrently, a system of earthen dykes and ditches was erected around the Pale marches to inhibit cattle rustling. Here's an example of what was thought to be the Pale ditch. The arrangements for militia service by the region's inhabitants were also reorganised at this time, so that those residing within the Pale heartland, or Mahery as it was called, turned out equipped with traditional English weapons such as bills and longbows, whereas Marcher landowners kept Irish troops, kern and horsemen to defend their estates. So by 1494, when Sir Edward Poynings arrived as governor, the region's defences had been substantially reorganised. What had been a typical medieval march, with defence in depth and an extended wasteland interposed between English and Irish, had been transformed into a closely delineated frontier with standing defences. The region itself was also carefully divided into an inner heartland, or Mahery, and an outer ring, the Marches. Poynings's novel description of this region as the English Pale thus reflected this new reality, and the new defences also facilitated English expansion in border districts, promoting more stable conditions in the Pale Mahery and thereby encouraging a great expansion of arable farming or tillage there. Tillage, in the official rhetoric of the day, was a key feature of English civility. And after 1534 too, the revived English Pale provided a secure bridgehead for the Tudor conquest. In reality then, the English Pale was a frontier region, a micro-region of the 16th century English state. But significantly, it's rarely studied historically in its English context. Rather, as is commonly the case with other regions, the Pale's history is chiefly studied in the context of national history, meaning in this case as an integral part of Ireland, not as an English outpost. The descendants of the English of early Tudor Ireland were of course later on subsumed into an Irish nation, and with the partition of Ireland in 1920, the Pale, which had once been Ireland's English heartland, became the core territory of an independent Irish Free State, which was keen to emphasise its Gaelic pedigree. Conversely, the one Irish region which, after 1920, remained part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, was in the 16th century Ireland's most Gaelic province. In the context of Irish historiography, therefore, the study of the English Pale as a Tudor frontier region was doubly problematic, both in respect of its English identity and also in that its status as a frontier between two nations seemed to lend historical underpinning to the modern partition of the island. It's only within the last 15 years that the Pale has come to be studied in its own terms in regard to its extent, chronology and nomenclature, in contrast with medieval Ireland, where the problem of the frontier between English and Irish nations has attracted a good deal of attention over the years. But in the nationalist grand narrative, the Pale's place is long established and revealing. It's portrayed as the product of late medieval English decline, a shrinking remnant of the medieval colony. The 15th century, the early 15th century being designated the period which saw the emergence of the Pale, omitting the word English, which betrayed its identity. The Pale's English inhabitants were likewise shorn of their identity, being retrospectively relabelled as Anglo-Irish. And maps of the shrinking Pale, such as you see before you, charted the fate of this vain attempt to shore up English rule, until finally in 1534 Henry VIII abandoned this failed strategy in favour of complete conquest and a new colonisation. So traditional accounts depicted the English Pale as a continuation of the medieval march, ignoring its essential character as an international frontier of separation, a Trennungsgrenze. They described instead two varieties of Irishmen, Anglo-Irish and Gaelic Irish, interacting across a dissolving frontier. There is no established tradition of regional history in Ireland, and that certainly is a point which is itself very revealing. In the late 16th century, works like the Book of Howth or Richard Stanihurst's description of Ireland celebrated the Pale's culture and the exploits of the Palesmen, while it denigrated their naughty neighbours. But there are now no museums or exhibitions to commemorate the achievements of the Palesmen, and only a vague popular memory of what the English Pale once was. Recently, however, a number of conferences have been held on the English Pale, bringing together scholars from the different disciplines interested in this topic. The main contributions have come from archaeology, geography, and from history. Archaeologists, for instance, have investigated many of the tower houses, notably the so-called 10-pound castles, also the churches and the various Pale earthworks. Geographers have addressed the Pale's spatial dimensions and the development of manorial settlements there. Historians have studied individual Palesmen, nobles and gentry, and their families, as well as religion, government, and politics in the region. For the most part, however, these studies of the Pale region are conducted firmly within a national context, and the topics treated have, by and large, reflected the national agenda. Thus, the so-called Gaelicisation of the Pale figures prominently in the literature, as also the origins of an Irish identity among the Pale's inhabitants. But on the other hand, the European Union's vision of a Europe of the regions has not been taken up in this context. In fact, the concept of the English Pale as a specific region with its own identity bounded by time and place is not really developed in the literature. Rather, the Pale simply provides a convenient peg on which to hang discussions of developments, medieval, Tudor developments and post-Tudor developments, which happen to have occurred in that part of Ireland. Yet, following the recent political settlement in Northern Ireland, it may well be that the resultant swing towards a more inclusive approach to Ireland's varied past will soon prompt a reappraisal of the Pale's distinctive heritage as an outpost of English culture in the 16th century. Thank you.